Dear digital friends, as you can see, the shock waves are sweeping over us, the pandemic and the war. The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine has shattered hopes of a strong global economic recovery from the coronavirus, at least in the short term. The markets are shaken and the increased geopolitical tension are set to aggravate high inflation and supply chain bottlenecks. What we can say is for sure a difficult moment. It's a particular moment for those like us, the financial market participants, who see the value of portfolios decreasing. And while we feel a certain responsibility towards our client, our financial institution, and our families, we might feel disoriented. It comes to my mind how the doctors felt when the pandemic started. In what state of confusion were they? How afraid were they? Nevertheless, they were next to the patient, not only in search of a possible cure, but also, and above all, providing the psychological support. And that is exactly what we need to follow as we are the specialists of the financial system. I'm very honored to welcome you to the first episode of our platform Spot and Forward under name Lazarus Rising, where our friend Alastair Newton, the former diplomat of the British Foreign Service, will help us get a better understanding on how things will look like in the longer term. Before jumping into the geopolitical morass, Alastair, I have a personal question for you. What led you to choose this profession?
I didn't really choose it, it chose me. I was recruited into the diplomatic service in 1985, and then it was actually down to the Russians that I finished up moving to the city. The Gecko default in particular in 1998. I was heading up economic relations. We started liaising with the city over the global economic crisis at that time. Out of that, I went on secondment to Lehman Brothers in 2000. Lehman Brothers invited me to stay. There was a delay because of the dot-com bubble, but I left the service and joined Lehman Brothers in 2005. The rest is history. I guess I just got very lucky.
You have been arguing for some years now that big picture, nothing we are seeing in the world today should come as a surprise. Do you stand by that still? And if so, why?
As you know, my most recent presentation is entitled Lazarus Rising with the subtitle The Return of History, ? Which is obviously honouring Francis Fukuyama and his End of History book published in 1991. A book which I have to say is seriously misrepresented. Fukuyama did not say it was the end of history as such. There's all sorts of qualifications around that, including a very interesting section in which he states quite explicitly that if men have not got a principle to fight for, there will always be men who fight back against that principle. If you regard Western model of democracy and free markets as being that principle, Putin is clearly a man who is now fighting back strongly against that. Bigger picture still, and here I'm going to cite another American, Mark Twain, who said that history rhymes. We know that history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. And for that reason in particular, we shouldn't be surprised by anything which is happening in the world today, because we are at a classic moment, the end of a geopolitical cycle. Now, even I, at my age, have not lived through a full geopolitical cycle because it lasts about 100 years. And we are, I think everybody would agree, at the end of the American period of hegemony, moving into a multipolar world. Hegemonies are very good for economic growth because they remove barriers to trade, trade expands, economies grow, societies become richer, although as we know these days, not everybody in society benefits equally in those circumstances. At the end of a hegemon, exactly the reverse happens. Barriers to trade go up, economic growth slows, sometimes goes into reverse, societies become poorer, and sadly, very often these periods end in war. Usually, the power in decline, relative decline, starting a war against a rising power. What is known as Thucydides' trap, so called by Graham Allison, the American geopolitics professor, named after an Athenian general 600 years before Christ, Thucydides. What Putin has done is stepped into Thucydides' trap. Russia, Soviet Union, was a regional hegemony during the Cold War days. That hegemony ended dramatically in 1989 and then further ended in 1991 with the breakup of the Soviet Union. By launching a war against Ukraine, Russia, a declining power, has launched a proxy war against what you may consider to be a rising power, the European Union, plus of course NATO. So again, no surprise whatsoever that this is happening if we look at the big picture. Clearly the details are more difficult. It doesn't mean we can discern exactly what's going to happen next, but we do have a very clear idea. And there's one more thing I would add to this, and this is that what we're seeing, as Martin Wolf described in the Financial Times recently, is kind of apocalypse now in a way. And Martin has cited the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If we consider what that means just explicitly: plague, COVID-19, war, Ukraine, Russia, famine. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say famine, but if we are thinking about what's happening with food prices now, a subject to which I think we're going to return later during this talk, and then death. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are riding today.
It seems clear that Russia's immediate objective in Ukraine have changed. What, if anything, does this tell us about Vladimir Putin's overall objective and the likelihood of him achieving them?
I don't think the shift in the Russian focus from Kiev to the Donbass region actually tells us very much at all about changing objectives. I think Putin's objectives have always been very clear from the outset, which is not only to reabsorb Ukraine into Russia, but actually to push back the boundaries of the Western expansion into Central Europe. To push it back, to reset the Cold War boundaries, if you like, hopefully even to push the Americans out of Europe altogether and to dismantle NATO. If he succeeds in whatever his detailed objectives are in Ukraine, that will not be the end of it by any means. Moldova has started to hit the headlines recently for very good reason. Security issues in Transnistria, where there are already a considerable number of Russian soldiers. The Baltic republics are clearly very concerned about the threat posed to them. We've seen Russia threatening Finland in particular, Sweden to a slightly lesser extent, if they were to join NATO, as I personally think Finland certainly will. The Swedes maybe we'll see after the general election there in September. I think that could be a decisive moment for them. And of course, Finland and Russia do have history. So Putin's objectives, I think, are very, very clear indeed. They're not exactly synonymous with the Soviet Union, but they are very synonymous with Imperial Russia. And it is no surprise whatsoever if you think about the history of Russia over the last 2 centuries or so, that Putin is very, very focused on the perceived threat from the West. When in my view, actually, in reality, he should be looking over his shoulder at China. Because if he gets this wrong, as I think he is doing at the moment, there is every possibility that Russia will find itself a vassal state of China within the next decade. In other words, what I'm saying to you is I don't think he's going to achieve his objectives.
Ukraine was a lost cause for Washington. Is it now a strategic opportunity?
I'm not sure that I would agree totally with the way you put that question, because I don't think Ukraine has ever been a totally lost cause for Washington. If we think back to the events of 2014, clearly the Americans were very supportive of the protests at that time, and they saw a good result from the perspective of the West emerge from that. Clearly, it also has had mounting bad consequences since then and is a key element in where we've got to today. But yes, the second part of your question is absolutely right. This is a strategic opportunity for the US. I think on the plus side, we can reasonably say that it has given President Biden the opportunity to pull the Western allies together. And when I say Western, I include countries in Asia as well, Australasia and Asia, Japan and Australia notably. But there is perhaps a darker side to this. A number of experts firmly believe that America is using Ukraine to try to bleed Russia dry, seeing Ukraine as a latter-day Afghanistan not necessarily in the context of the American experience in Afghanistan, but the Soviet experience in Afghanistan 20 odd years before that.
In the light of your comments about support globally for the US over Ukraine, what are the implications for US alliance building in Asia? In particular, do you see India remaining in the Quad?
And one of the important things that we need to keep firmly in mind is, despite statements from Washington, even from Joe Biden himself, that it's the world against Russia, it is not. You only have to look at the votes in the United Nations to see that there is a whole host of countries which are sitting on the fence one way or the other, including some nominal allies of the United States, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They're being very, very cautious about coming down firmly on one side or the other. And one of the key reasons for this is what a lot of the world sees as Western hypocrisy. Give a specific example, the Americans, in this lack of support from some countries, are paying a price which one could reasonably associate with the American invasion of Iran. Morally, much of the world sees very little difference between the American invasion of Iran in 2003 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it's not the world versus Russia. And India is a really good example of a country which you would say actually perhaps ought to be siding with the US as a vibrant democracy, until one considers the deep historic and current ties between India and Russia, India's long history during the Cold War era of being a leading member of the non-aligned movement. Now, having said that, I think the Indians need to be really, really careful because of the alliance between Russia and China. And China does continue to pose a real threat to India, as we've seen with various border skirmishes, even over the last 4 or 5 years. So I think the Indians have got a lot to think about in this particular power struggle which is going on today. But for the time being, I have to say that I can't entirely blame them for trying to stay fairly neutral.
Turning to Europe, we have all been surprised by the strength and unity of the EU response to the invasion of Ukraine. How effective do you think the successive waves of sanctions have been? And do you think unity can be sustained as the war drags on and possibly escalate further, for example, in Moldova?
Yes, first of all, I think what Europe has actually achieved so far, unified, has astonished everybody, even the Europeans themselves. They have seized this opportunity, they have worked together so far. And let's be clear about this. This is actually the third crisis with which Europe has had to grapple within 6 years. First of all, the Brexit vote in the UK, relatively minor crisis, to be honest, compared to what has followed since, but still seen by some at the time as posing an existential threat to Europe. Wrongly, in my view. Clearly, history would agree with that. COVID-19, major crisis. Europe, after a slightly shaky start, did manage to pull together fairly well over COVID-19. But they have gone a further quantum leap, or even two, over the Ukraine crisis. But from here on, it gets much more difficult. And we're already seeing the beginnings of this with what hopefully will be, hopefully from a European perspective, be the 6th package of sanctions, where at least a couple of countries are going to need to be carved out of any embargo on imports of Russian oil. Very important that Russia does begin to be starved of funds for energy. The Europeans like to make a lot of noise about the amount of aid they are giving to Ukraine, and justifiably so. But when one considers the amount of money which Europe is paying to Russia for gas and oil, the amount of money going in aid of one sort or another is relatively small. So more difficult from here on, but as the French would say, chapeau à l'Europe for its progress so far. And I would say in particular for Germany. Germany has taken a lot of criticism from many quarters. But when one considers where Germany started, and where the Scholz administration has taken it to in the space of just 8 weeks, it has been quite an astonishing transformation with a lot of what were formerly solid principles in German policy cast to one side in order to respond to the crisis in Ukraine. So I think Olaf Scholz deserves a lot of credit. I also think that Robert Habeck, Germany's Vice Chancellor and the Economy Minister, and a Green, deserves a lot of credit.
Related following his re-election in France, do you think that Emmanuel Macron will be able to realize his strategic vision for the EU?
I'm very optimistic, I have to say, about Europe's prospects. We've already talked about this being the third crisis with which it's grappled. We've seen lots of evidence during COVID of Europeans working more closely together. And that, of course, as I said earlier, has gone through a quantum jump or two, thanks to the Ukraine crisis. But I think there is also one other reason why Macron, who undoubtedly is going to be the leader of Europe, is likely to be successful. And that reason lies in America. Now, we talked earlier about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and as some of your members may remember from my forecast for this year, horses are four-toed ungulates, a particular subgroup of mammals. And so are grey rhinos. And I talked about grey rhinos at the beginning of the year because I will not talk about black swans. We can't talk about black swans. They're unknown unknowns, whereas the grey rhino is a known unknown, to continue to quote Don Rumsfeld. Donald Trump is a grey rhino, and the prospect of Trump being re-elected, a distinct possibility, and being back in the White House in January 2025 should be sufficient, in my view, just of itself to keep Europe on the track which Macron wants to see it on, of moving to strategic autonomy.
China. There was much concern at the start of the war in Ukraine that China would seize the moment to invade Taiwan. Such concerns have clearly faded since. Where do you think Xi Jinping stands today in relation to not only Taiwan, but also Russia?
Taiwan is very much another grey rhino sitting out there. And there is, in my view, a real significant probability that sooner or later Xi Jinping, assuming he remains in power, will elect to try to take Taiwan by force, because we can be clear that the Taiwanese are not about to voluntarily rejoin the mainland. However, I was never at all persuaded by the thought that Xi Jinping might use the war in Ukraine as cover to invade Taiwan. His biggest single priority today is securing his third term of office at the party congress, which will probably be held in November. He has a whole raft of domestic challenges: the economy, COVID, his restructuring virtually vast swathes of Chinese industry, including the tech sector in particular, to be more accountable to the Communist Party, his consolidation of power, his determination to keep the Communist Party in power in perpetuity. To invade Taiwan now, a massive risk. Seaborne invasion, very difficult. China's never done one. Would be something I just can't see him doing. And I think the Chinese will be quite happy to sit quietly for the time being and to learn lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war. And as far as Xi Jinping's attitude towards Russia and Putin is concerned, as I remarked earlier, I think Xi Jinping will see this as an opportunity. The Russians are going to have to sell their gas and oil to China. China will build the pipelines, and then they'll take the hydrocarbons for next to nothing.
One of the concerns about Taiwan is its dominance in cutting-edge chip manufacturing. This is in many ways a big question put under a harsh spotlight by not only the war, but also COVID of global supply chain and possible rolling back of globalization. How concerned should we be about this?
You know, the death of globalization has been declared many times. Just before COVID, I was touring in Asia on behalf of one of my clients. The main focus of the series of presentations we were giving was deglobalization. Was it a reality? Since then, COVID has come along, and clearly that has added weight to this discussion. One of the issues I have with the death of globalization scenario is that I think it concentrates far too much on manufactured goods. And if we think about the world today and the way in which the global economy works, manufactured goods is actually a very small percentage of what globalization really is. Globalization is also about financial flows, as all your members know very well indeed. It's about ideas. It's about people moving from one country to another. Again, as you yourself know very well, Vincenzo, as an Italian working in Luxembourg, and as obviously I know as a Brit living in Zambia. It's about flows of all sorts of stuff. And if we think about tourism today, about financial flows, about migration, temporary or long-term, we can see that actually the world is still pretty vibrant. There are going to be changes, of course, and changes in manufacturing, flow of manufacturing goods were underway in any case. Just-in-time delivery, the need for suppliers to be nearer to their marketplace because of personal choice. When I bought my first Apple machine in 2002, there was one iPod. I was in the Apple shop in London a few days ago, and the choice of mobile phones I had was baffling. I mean, there were at least a dozen models and all in different colors. Completely different to 2002. That requires close-at-hand manufacturing. 3D printing stands to revolutionize a lot of the way we look at manufacturing. That's happening today. That's happening today, and it's only going to get bigger. So I don't think that despite this being the end of a period of hegemony, the end of a geopolitical cycle, I don't think we're going to see the end of globalization by any means. I think we're going to see globalization continue to evolve.
Here is an easy question for you. What will be the price of Brent crude of the year end?
Well, I have a forecast for Brent crude at the end of this year, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. It's wrong. It's wrong. Fortunately, I'm not paid to forecast the price of oil. But I reckon that even most of those people who are will probably get it wrong this year. And let me just give you a range. We have Goldman Sachs, very reputable, good analysts, $200 a barrel at the end of the year. Former colleague of mine, Ed Morse, working for Citibank these days, 70. $70. Now, Ed Morse's forecast takes a bit of explanation. It presupposes a number of things. First of all, that the world is going to go into recession. Would you rule it out? I mean, the IMF has now lowered its growth forecast twice in 4 months. And most of the people I know in financial markets think that this trend is far from over, that we're going to see further lowering of growth forecasts. It presupposes that the US shale industry is going to ramp up more quickly than had previously been expected. We're already seeing that. It probably presupposes too that even though the process seems to have stalled, the US and Iran are going to do a deal, and we're going to see Iranian oil coming back onto markets. Personally, I wouldn't rule out $200 a barrel. I think that's quite feasible if the Europeans were to move faster than expected on embargoing Russian oil. But equally, I could still see a sell-off before the end of the year, and oil coming back, maybe not to 70, but certainly to below the price it is today.
If anything, the war in Ukraine seems so far to have been a setback for Joe Biden's decarbonization ambition in the US. But some argue that it will be a boost for Europe. Do you agree?
I do agree, definitely. I think we're going to see a big push on renewables in Europe. For Biden, it's a very different situation. His biggest single concern at the moment is the price of gasoline at the pump in the US, with an eye to the midterm elections, when clearly the Democrats are going to struggle enormously to retain a majority in either house of Congress. My personal belief is that they will fail. History tends to point in that direction too. But Biden is not dependent on Russian oil or gas. Europe is. And Europe clearly no longer wishes to be beholden to Vladimir Putin and Russia. And they're, given the momentum which is already behind the decarbonisation process in Europe, this is only going to add to it. And I think we're going to see some big developments in Europe in decarbonisation. Not just renewables, there will still be a focus on hydrogen as well, despite the reservations which I have about hydrogen personally. Keep in mind, Germany's already put in 9 billion euros into hydrogen development. I can only see that going up. course, there will be some compromises. I can't see the French agreeing to regard nuclear power as being anything other than renewable and consistent with decarbonisation. France and Germany will no doubt argue about that, but I think the broad way forward is clear.
Consideration of energy and food prices take us to the question of inflation, which is weighing increasingly heavily on investors and central bankers alike. How concerned should we be?
Very, in my view. I was at a dinner in London a few days ago with a bunch of buy-side clients, and the topic of inflation inevitably came up. There was a former colleague of mine actually at the table, very, very smart economist, had worked with the Fed and with the US Treasury Department previously. And he remarked that maybe we shouldn't be too worried about inflation because central bankers in America and elsewhere had done a lot of research into the causes of inflation and how to counter it over the last 20 or so years when really we've not seen a lot of inflation in the global economy. And he talked a bit about this. And I have to say, I was a little concerned because I know from my own discussions with central bankers that despite all this research, which they have indeed done, they still don't really understand inflation. Privately, they will admit to that. They don't like to say it to the public because you don't want to undermine the credibility of your central bank. But privately, they are concerned. And I would add to that concern that personally, all that research sounds to me a bit like central bankers' version of generals fighting the last war. And we all know from what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and the Russian reliance on tanks, how foolish generals fighting the last war can be. So yes, I think we do need to be concerned about inflation. I think it is a problem. I don't think we do necessarily have the answer to it. And I think we should also be concerned about it from a financial market perspective. I walked across a trading floor in London a few days ago for the first time for 3 years. And I was chatting with somebody a little bit younger than me, but very experienced fund manager, just shortly after that. And I said to him, do you know what scared me most about walking across that trading floor? He said, yes, I do, without you even telling me. You didn't see anybody there over the age of 30. I said, absolutely right. There was nobody there who has any experience at all of trading falling markets. And they all think they're immortal. And they're going to discover when markets start to fall that they are not.
Yet another related concern revolves around the impact of US sanctions, in particular on the status of the dollar, as the world's reserve currency. How seriously should we take the perceived threat to the green pact's primacy?
You know, rather like the death of globalization school of thought, the doomsday for the dollar school of thought keeps going round and round and round. And it's a bit like the old joke about economists have rightly predicted 9 of the past 3 recessions. I think death of the dollar is another grossly overrated topic of conversation. And let's put some numbers on this. If we go back to the year 2000, around about 71% of FX reserves globally were in dollars. Today, it's about 59%. Okay, so that's a 12 percentage point fall. But it's still telling us that over 50% of global FX reserves are in dollars. And then if we take that 12 percentage point, we see something even more interesting. About a quarter of that has gone to China. In other words, 3 percentage points. The rest of it has nearly all gone to smaller Western economies, the Scandis, Switzerland, Canada, Australia. So what we're seeing is we're seeing that money go to, those reserves go to American allies. And as we've seen in the case of Russian reserves, in a crisis, America's allies have rallied and worked with America. I would say personally that the dollar is very likely to be the dominant global currency for, I don't know, another 50 years. And I can say that with a degree of confidence because I won't personally be around to find out if I was wrong or not.
Finally, the US is determined to help Ukraine at all costs. Russia is determined to finish what they have started. Where does this end?
I think this is probably the single most worrisome question of all the ones which you've asked today. Vincenzo, Vladimir Putin cannot afford to lose. And it's not clear how far he actually needs to go in order to be able to claim credibly to the Russian people that he has achieved his objectives. You know, it is often said that Putin surely would not, and then he does. And I think we do need to take very seriously indeed the possibility that Putin could resort to some sort of demonstration with a nuclear weapon. Now, I'm sorry to end this discussion on such a dismal note, but in all seriousness, I simply don't think that when we are talking about Vladimir Putin, you can rule that out. Well, notwithstanding my slightly gloomy conclusion, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you today, and always a pleasure to be working with the LFMA and its members. So thank you very much for this opportunity to air some views on the state of the world today and the challenges we all face.
Alastair, on behalf of LFMA, I would like to thank you for your time and the participation. And I can definitely dare to say that we got some very useful insights for what we can expect in the near future.
Well, hopefully I'll be back in Europe in September, and then you and your members can tell me where I got it wrong today.
Perfect. So see you in September.
Thank you.
Thank you.